All right, hello everybody. How is everybody today? Welcome to ConnectTech. How many of you, is this your first time attending ConnectTech? Perfect. Hopefully we'll see you again next year. I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation. I'm going to be talking about an introduction to Flexbox with real-world examples. To give you some information about myself, my name is Jennifer Bland. A little bit about my background. I used to be a programmer for over 10 years. I was a Lotus Notes developer. So how many of you have ever heard of Lotus Notes? Okay, excellent. I stopped programming and got out of programming, and the reason why is, how many of you have a company that still uses Lotus Notes? Okay, that's why I stopped programming. I got out of programming. I started working in other areas. My last job that I had was I was a project manager at Aaron's, the rent-to-own company. I worked in their training department. On the side, I had built up an internet marketing business, and it got to the point where my internet marketing business was making more money than I was making in my day job. So at the age of 51, I retired. And with my internet marketing business, I didn't have to ever work again in my life. So I was retired for about 2 years, walked into a Barnes & Noble bookstore, and on their clearance rack, they had a book on JavaScript programming. And I picked it up, went home, worked through it, and learned all of the things, did all the exercises that were in the book for the next 2 months, and then realized how much of a passion I had for programming when I used to do it many years ago. So I decided I wanted to get back into programming, so I came out of retirement, went and attended one of those 3-month coding boot camps that you hear about. I attended Hack Reactor, which is based out in California, and then got a job working at CNN here in Atlanta a month after I graduated. And now I'm a senior software engineer at Stanley Black & Decker in their digital accelerator. So that gives you a little bit of information about my background. But what I want to give you is a game that I play with on my audiences every time I do a speak. Is I'm going to give you what's called 3 truths and 1 lie about myself. And I'm going to let you think about it, and at the end of my presentation, I'll tell you which one of those 4 statements is not true. So here are the 4 statements, so y'all get to think about which one you think is not true. 3 are true, 1 is not. I'm going to give you 4 statements that all have to do with British royalty. Okay? So number 1, I asked Prince Charles for his autograph at the halftime of a University of Georgia football game. Number 2, I have attended Easter worship service at Windsor Castle with Queen Elizabeth. Number 3, I got stuck in an elevator for 10 minutes with Princess Diana at the Royal Military Tattoo in Edinburgh. Number 4, I've attended Prince Philip, who is the Duke of Edinburgh's 80th birthday at Edinburgh Castle in Edinburgh, Scotland. So those are 4 things. Think about it. 1 of them is not true. 3 of them are true. So let me go ahead and get started on my presentation. I'm not going to do my presentation like a traditional presentation. I'm not going to set my slides up into slide mode and just let you read my slides. I'm going to be doing a lot of hands-on. So I'm going to be using Keynote in this manner here where I'm not running in full screen mode, because I'm going to be toggling back and forth between my editor and my browser so that you can actually see the code as I'm talking. If you want to follow along with what I've got going, you can go out to my GitHub repo, and there is this thing called Intro to Flexbox that's in my GitHub repo that you can download, and I'll walk through these samples as we go through the presentation. So I'll give you a little bit of information of why Flexbox came about. Is you have to have an understanding of the history of CSS. When CSS came out, it was designed to basically position things on the screen, and it provided very simple instructions available to you to be able to position things on the screen. CSS is based off of a box model. So everything is a square, even if the image is not a square. Everything is a square. It has, you know, the padding, the margins, the border, all of that as part of the box model. And if you wanted to position an image, you know, for example, you want to put an image to the left and then you want to put text on the right about that image, you would have to use, traditionally in CSS, you would have to use a float, that you would float something either left or right, and then after you displayed that more on the page, you would actually have to go out and clear that float to be able to do it. And if you wanted something to position an exact location on the screen, then you had to either use position fixed or position absolute in order to put it at that specific location on the screen. And so that's one of the challenges that you had with CSS. So what happened was Flexbox came out was it allows you to use new CSS styling features that are built into Flexbox to allow you to achieve positioning things on the screen a lot easier. And that's what Flexbox stands for, because it's a flexible box layout and it allows you to see things and display things easier on the screen. You actually have more control over positioning items with Flexbox than you do with traditional CSS. Some of the benefits of using Flexbox instead of traditional CSS or using some third-party library such as Bootstrap, and a lot of people use Bootstrap, is Flexbox is built into the CSS standard. You don't have to load a library, so you don't have to go out and load Bootstrap, you know, their files, their Bootstrap CSS library, their Bootstrap.JavaScript library. You don't have to have that burden of almost 200K of things that you add to your website in order to be able to style your website. So Flexbox is built in, so it gives you things that your application will load faster, your website will load faster, because you don't have that burden that you have on there. And then it also gives you ability to give you better designs on the flexible layouts. And the good thing about it, and I think that's one of the best selling points, is you no longer have to use floats in order to display things on the screen. It becomes a lot easier with Flexbox. So a lot of people think, well, is it safe for me to be able to use Flexbox? There is a website called caniuse.com, and on that website you can actually look at something and determine whether or not it's going to be supported in different browsers and different versions of browsers. Because most people that make website applications, they set a standard to say, we support these browsers on our application, we support these versions of these browsers in our application. So if you start looking at this, what you'll see in pretty much every browser that's out there, it has support for Flexbox. So it's something that you can actually use. You can actually even use it on mobile development devices, and it has support for Flexbox. So in order to use Flexbox, what you end up doing is you actually define something that's going to be a parent container. That parent container that you define as being Flex, and then everything that's a child item of that parent are going to be what's called Flex items. And these Flex items are going to be styled based on the whatever CSS that you define to the parent item, which is your Flex container that you have out there. And then you can control how big things are, how small they are, if there's space between them, and so forth, all based on providing Flex properties available to you. So the first thing that you want to do to get started with Flex is that you have to define your parent container that you're going to be using. And to do that, you just define either a class or an ID, it doesn't matter which, and then you give it a CSS style, and that style is display, and that property is Flex. So if you're familiar with using the display property, Flex is what gives you the ability to use Flex directly within your application itself. The next thing that you have to understand is once you've created a parent container is you have to understand about flex axis, because that makes you understand how things are going to be laid out on this screen. You have what's called a main axis and a cross axis. Things are styled differently between the main axis and the cross axis. If you create a container that is display flex, by default, it assumes that the main axis is going to be running from left to right. Very similar to if you're reading a book, we read from left to right, we go from top to bottom. The cross axis, so you have the main axis going from left to right. The cross axis is what goes from vertical, and it goes from top to bottom. It's possible that you can change that, and you can have your main axis going from top to bottom. And if you do that, then therefore your cross axis is what's going to be going from left to right. And of course, you can reverse both of those and have them going from right to left or from bottom to top. So you have a wide range available to you. So in order to set the main axis and the cross axis is once you've just done your property of display flex, what you would then do is you would say the flex direction. If you want it to be the main axis to be horizontal, you would say the flex direction is going to be row. And that's what is the default standard. So if you set a container to be display flex, but then don't specify the flex direction, it assumes that that direction is going to be row. You can also set the flex direction to be column, so therefore it goes up and down. So the default selection for the flex direction is row, and what you'll see here is the main axis is left to right, the cross axis is from top to bottom. The main axis and the cross axis are always perpendicular. It just doesn't matter which one starts, the other one is always going to be perpendicular to it. Here's another option that you can put in, and you would have to specify this if you want to use it, because flex direction row is assumed if you don't provide it. If you set the flex direction and have the value of column, then it will be from top to bottom, and that will allow you to align things vertically. So here's what we're going to do, and we're going to go through and actually display things. So let me come back over here. So here, just to get going, is if we wanted to display something as flex, hopefully you can read that with the small font size. But what we have here is I have a parent container right here where I've given a class of flex container. And the flex container has a display of flex. So that's my parent. I don't have to specify the flex direction because it's assumed. And then I have 4 divs that are underneath that. Normal CSS, a div is a block level element. A block level element is it will take up the line. It doesn't matter if there's space remaining on the line. Everything else will go to the line below that. So if we look at how that is displayed in Flexbox, here's the example. These are the 4 divs that I've created. That by default, they're all on the horizontal row. I don't have to just say display inline so that it takes that div out of being a block element and convert it to an inline element. Flex by default, because the parent is flex and the main axis is a row, it puts everything on that same row. So that's how we get that ability to display that. Now, if we come back and we look here at the second element, where I talked about earlier was you have a flex direction that you can specify being row or column. So what we have here is we have the same 4 buttons with the flex direction of row. So if we come back over here and look at example 2, we have what we had previously. So now if I come over here and I change this and I say I want it to be column, I can come over here and I reverse it. And now what you see is my main axis is going from top to bottom. my cross axis is now going left to right. There's also an option that's available to you is that you have row, and this should be column, hold on. And then you can also do reverses. So you can do column reverse, you can do row reverse. And when you look at it, now what it's doing is it's creating this as a column going from the bottom to the top. And so it reverses that. And if I wanted to make this row reverse, and you look at it, it goes from right to left. And that's the difference between those. Now, if we come back over here, and what we're going to do is actually go through the process of creating the outline of a calculator. So if you have a calculator on your phone, you're used to seeing what that calculator looks like. You know, it's got rows, it's got, you know, the big equal sign at the bottom, it's got, you know, the values across the top that goes the full length. So what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be showing you how to use Flexbox, be able to take this information that we have here, where it's nothing more than a parent div that I've just have it defined with the display flex. And then I have individual divs, and each one of those divs correspond to a number that's going to be on the calculator. And if you look at my CSS, it's very simple. I just say the display flex. I have my flex direction of row, and then each button is just going to be a square 50 pixels by 50 pixels. So if we come over and look at how that looks when it's laid out, here's what it looks like. Because all of the stuff by default is a flex row. So it's putting all of those characters on a single row. So if you think about what we've talked about just so far about having display information about flex, having it be a row or a column, how do you think that you would go about changing this HTML to make it look more like a calculator? So normally a calculator has 4 buttons per row, and then you have multiple rows. It's very simple. All you would need to do is to go back through and break it up and make each row its own flex container. So what I've done is I've wrapped each row, so it's pretty much the exact same thing, and I've wrapped each row in its own container. And when you come over here and you look at this, what you end up getting is you get the layout of a calculator by just adding a little bit of more HTML. And when you look at the HTML and the CSS, in here, you have a flex container that you display flex direction of row, and that flex container is going to be used to wrap every single row of the calculator. And then my buttons are pretty much the same thing. It's going to be a 50 pixel by 50 pixel square with a border on it. And what you end up with is pretty much the layout of a calculator. Now, I'll be talking about some of the other features because we want to modify this. For example, this equal on a regular calculator occupies these 2 spaces. So in a little bit later, I'll show you how you can do a very simple flex command to make that go full length. And then for the total up here at the top, I can show you how to make that full width so it takes up all 4 columns for the total that you have out there. All right. All right, is that still readable on the screen? The next thing that you have when you have a flex container is you end up having to do wrapping. Normally, by default, when I had my calculator and I had all the buttons, it showed all the buttons on the exact same row. Well, what you might want to do is actually have it wrap. So instead of wrapping every line in its own container, you can actually make the whole thing wrap. So if every one of your buttons on your calculator is 50 pixels by 50 pixels, and there are 4 buttons on each row, then you know that each row is going to be 200 pixels wide. And then what you can do is tell it that your main container is 200 pixels wide, and then you tell it to wrap the thing. So when it hits the end, it will start wrapping to the next line. And so you can easily make that change and end up making your calculator where it's a fixed width, and then everything just wraps individually along those lines. So what we have here is we have example number 4, and I've come back here and I've got that exact same thing. I have one container and all of my buttons, and the only thing that I've done differently in here is I've set a width on my container. So my parent is going to be 200 pixels wide, and I'm going to tell it to wrap the items as it goes along. So if you come over here and you look at this, it's pretty much the exact same layout, but it's a lot less HTML that you have to write to get that same configuration. The trade-off between these two designs that you have, between wrapping each row and then just having the parent and then making every item in that parent wrap on each row, is the first solution is a little bit more responsive. So if you wanted to go down to a smaller screen, and the screen is maybe 150 pixels wide, this example won't work very well because it's going to be wider than the screen. But as long as it will fit within a screen, either one of these will work evenly well. There is some shortcuts that you can have where you can combine multiple of the flex commands in one command that's available. The first one that I want to share with you is a flex flow shorthand. And the flex flow is a combination between the flex direction, and the flex direction being row or column, and the wrap functionality that's available. So you can either put that down, all of it on one row. So if we come over here to example 5, what we do is we have your flex container, we have it display flex. So instead of having a line for flex direction and a thing for flex wrap and having 2 lines, I can combine those into a single line where I have my flex flow and tell it the first parameter that I give it is row, and then you tell it whether you want to wrap it or non-wrap it, and that it combines all of that into one single command. The next example that we have that I want to talk about is a couple of series of different flex commands, and then I can show you how you combine all 3 of those into one line. It's called flex grow, and it's pretty much as the name represents. Flex grow is what the element will do if the screen size is expanded, and the default value that you have is 0. But you can give it a different size, and it will tell you how much it grows relative to other items that are on the screen itself. So if you have 2 items, and you have one item that's flex 1 and another item that's flex 2, that flex 2 item will actually occupy twice as much space as a flex 1 because its value is twice as big. So when we talked about earlier about the calculator, you have that button on the bottom row that was just that 150 pixels by 50 pixels square, but we wanted it to be twice as wide. You can apply a flex grow property just to that button, and it will occupy 2 spaces that you have on there. The next one that we have is called flex shrink, which is the opposite of flex grow, and that's how your layout responds as the screen reduces in size. The default value is for flex shrink is 1. With flex grow, the default value is 0. And what it will do is it will adjust the size of the items so that it will adjust based on the size of the screen itself. The next thing that we have is flex bases, and this is the last of the 3 that I wanted to cover very quickly. And this is basically how much space or the size of an item before the space is actually distributed around it. And you can take all three of these commands and you can combine them in a shorthand method in a thing called the flex property. They're displayed in order, so you have flex and then you give it the grow, the shrink, and the basis. And usually the basis is 0. You can also give it a percentage on there. So you could say that it takes up 50% of the screen or 30% of the screen or something along that lines. Now, what we've done is if we come back to our calculator, we have here, I've gone back to the individual rows, and down here on my button for the equal signs that I want it to be 2 columns wide, I've specified a new class called double. And if you look at double, it just has flex 2. All of my other items have a default value of flex 1. So when we come back over and we look at our demo, you end up with the final version of our calculator. So what I've done is pretty much the exact same thing that we had before, and with less than about 10 lines of CSS, I've created this layout of a calculator, and it adjusts accordingly. So the results on the top are 4 columns wide. The equal at the bottom is 2 columns wide. Everything is 50 pixels by 50 pixels, and it fits easily on the screen, and it will adjust if I resize the screen. So that shows you the power of what you can do with Flexbox and being able to use it. The next thing is, I've talked about you have the main axis and then you have the cross axis. Well, you can actually align things on the axis itself. So if you put something on on the row, you can tell it to line up at the beginning of the row, at the end of the row, at the middle of the row, put space between the items on the row so that they're evenly spaced. You have all of those options available to you. The way that you specify the alignment on the main axis is with a property called justify content. And you can tell it whether or not to default at the start, the end, the middle, with space between it, space around it. The default value, if you don't specify it, is at the start of the main axis. So your main axis may be on the row. It may be row reverse, so it starts from right to left. It can be from top to bottom if you're column, or from bottom to top if your main axis is column reverse. So here is an example, and I'll come over here and show you how this looks. Here is an example of all the options that are available to you for justify content and displaying information on the main axis. So the very top example, you have 3 boxes that I've put in, and I've had it set up so that the justify content is flex start. The second one is flex end, so it moves it all the way to the right. The one in the middle is center, so it centers it on the screen. And if you resize the screen, it will adjust accordingly so that it remains center on the screen. The difference between the last two, you have space between and space around. The main difference between the two is with space between, the first item and the last item are aligned on the margins. And then you have white spaces between every item between them. With space around, you end up with space before the first item and after the last item. And you take all the white spaces, you take all the items that you're going to be displaying on your main axis, sum up the size of all of them, take the width of your screen or your parent item, which is your flex container, subtract that, and then it evenly divides the white space between all of those items. It will evenly divide amount of white space on the space around to the left and to the right of that item. So when you look at space around, the amount of space to the right of the purple and to the left of the orange square is less than the amount of space between the first and the second item that's on the screen. And the reason why is you're looking at the space that's to the right of the orange as well as to the left of the green that's in between those two block items. What you have to the left of the orange one is just one item. So in between you end up with two, so that's why it looks like there's more space between them. If your main axis is a column, you can actually display things on the column so you have the exact same layouts available to you. So here's what it would look like when you are looking at your main axis being a column. So you can either do flex start, flex end, center, space between, or space around, and you have that available to you just as much on a column layout as you have it on a row layout. The next thing in specifying the alignment on the screen is we talked about setting up the alignment on the main axis. Now what you can do is you can actually lay things out on the cross axis, which is the vertical part that goes across the main axis. And you can specify what's available to you. If you don't specify anything, the default is stretch. So here's some examples of what you can see when you align items. What you have is the main axis is left to right, and then the cross axis goes from top to bottom. So by telling it flex start, you're aligning it on that cross axis at the top of the column. And then you can see here the differences between these. You have pretty much the same that you have with justify content with flex start, flex end. You have center. Then the difference between the last two, instead of space around and space between, you have stretch, which basically means stretch it so that it fits the entire height of the cross axis. And then you have baseline. And what the difference between the two is baseline takes the middle of the items and then aligns everything that's in the parent based off of that baseline between them. Then you have align content, which basically tells you whether or not there's going to be white space between the items that are on there. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to go through and give you some other examples of how you can use Flexbox and implement difficult design things that used to be able to be challenging to do in CSS, and how to do the equivalent in using Flexbox. I have a second GitHub repo that's out there that's called Made with Flexbox that gives you all of these real-world examples, so make sure that you get both of these repos that are out there. And when you pull that up and you start looking at the real-world examples, it's going to be a simple layout, and it's going to show you how to do all these different things that are available to you. So the first thing that most people have that they want to have on a website is you want to have a navigation. And if you've ever used Bootstrap, you have to use nav, navbar, nav, justify, nav, nav right, all this, like to have the right side. Then you have the nav image on the left side and everything else like that. It's a lot easier to do the exact same layout in Flexbox. So if I come over here and we look at, for example, the navigation, what I have is very simple. Is I have a Flex container, I have my company name, and then I have in here another Flex container, and on that Flex container, I tell it to justify the content on Flex end, which that's what moves it to the right. And then here are the items that are in here. So when you come back over here and you look at that layout and how it works, it's very easy to put something on the left and then something on the right, and you don't have to worry about aligning things up like you do with Flexbox, because if you've ever done this equivalent navigation in Flexbox, you know that it takes up a lot more HTML to write the equivalent than what you've put in here to get the exact same layout. Now, the next thing that I want to show you is basically how to center an image on the screen, and then also how to put text overlaid on that image itself on the screen. So a lot of people on their website, they might want to put a full screen image or full screen video, for example, that occupies the full width of the screen itself. So, and this will change based on whether or not, so if I come over here and I start adjusting it, it will adjust for me automatically regardless of the screen. So you can see just by doing very simple in Flexbox, this works on a full screen laptop, and if I was like on a mobile phone, it will adjust down accordingly, and it will adjust the image for every single one. And then I have the option of actually putting text directly over that image. And when you look at the code, it's very simple. So in here, what it is I just have a div where I have a flex container, and then I actually have the text that actually shows up in the middle of the screen. And what that allows it to do is it actually allows me to specify that image to be full screen and have it available to me. So, third example that I want to show you is everybody needs to have a responsive website layout. And if you've ever used Flexbox, you have to worry about doing, like column 12, column 3, medium, extra large, small, depending on which type of screen that you have. With Flexbox, because you can use the Flex Grow and the Flex Shrink and the Flex Basis properties, you can have things that adjust accordingly to the screen size that's available that's out there. So what I have here is a very simple responsive web layout, and I have my menu that I showed you earlier across the top, and I've got a left sidebar. I've got my content in the middle, so if I had enough content and wanted to scroll, it would scroll the content that's in the middle, and I have my right sidebar. And the way that the left and right sidebars are set up to be responsive is there is that alignment on the cross axis, because in this layout, we have a row layout, and then you have the columns as your cross axis. So what I can do is align the items stretch on the cross axis. So therefore, my left sidebar and my right sidebar will stretch all the way from the top, which happens to be at the bottom of your menu, all the way down to your footer, regardless of what type of screen size that you're on. So it allows you to do something very easily from a CSS standpoint. Next one that I want to show you is how to do something as simple as adding on text to an input field. So you can actually put things in using Flexbox that you can tell it to go here at the beginning of your input box and then have information that you can put on there. So you can add things to an input box either to the beginning, as I have on the first row example where you have amount. So to users, it's very clear and distinct exactly what goes into that input box because you're telling them. Then you have on the next line where you might have an input and then a submit button on the end. And then you can actually combine these inputs and have something both at the beginning and at the end between them. So if you come over and you start looking at the code that's in there, it's very simple HTML that you've got. You've got your Flex container. You've got the information that comes in before. The amount, which is the add-on, and then the input field that's there. So it's very easy to put things in, and then it's just the styling and the CSS for the Flex properties that specifies whether that add-on is going to be at the beginning, or is it going to be at the end, or do you end up with having multiples of one that's going to be at the beginning and also at the end of itself. The next layout that I want to show you that you can do with Flexbox that makes things very easy is to do a traditional 3-column layout. Most websites usually end up with a 3-column layout, and usually they're displaying information about their company in a layout. You know, there might be like each column corresponds to a service that they offer, you know, or a product that they're offering, or what makes their company unique. So they have a column that's dedicated to each one of those. Usually if you're using something like Bootstrap, you end up having to specify things based on, you know, whether it's an extra small device, meaning like a cell phone, or a large device, which is a large screen, or medium, which is like, for example, my laptop screen. And you have to specify a different layout based on the screen size that's out there. With Flexbox, what I've done is I've just basically gone out and created 3 items that are in a Flex container, and I've just did the very simple space between so that you end up with that space between them, so that you have a little bit of margin between them so that the content is easily displayed between them. So if we come back over here, 3-column layout, ignore the amount of text that's on there, but basically what you end up doing is that you have your Flex container, and then inside the, you have your Flex container, and inside that you have a div with a class of column, and that is information that gives me that, you know, 3-column layout so that it's available to you. When you look at this, if you go back and if you pull down this repo that I've created with these examples and you want to look at how they're laid out, it has, over here you have a basic index.html that actually displays everything to you. And then I have a HTML page for each one of the 5 samples. So if you wanted to see the code for each one of the samples, then you can easily just go into each one individually, and in the style.css, I have the styles for all 5 examples in one CSS file, so you can basically pull out what you need. And the way that I have this organized in the CSS file is I have my default Flex items that are going to be used pretty much everywhere, and I've called the classes to correspond with the feature that Flex property is going to provide. So you have like a Flex container, you have a Flex item. If it's going to be starting at the start, I call the class Flex Start, and so forth. Then I have a couple of things that are going to be shared across items, so like, you know, what the color background, the white text, and so forth. And then for each of the demos, I have in here a section. So for example, for the navigation, you have in here, these are the styles that are used just for that navigation demo. These are the styles that I use for that responsive website. And you can see that the amount of CSS that you're writing is very much, you know, limited compared to what you would have to do with traditional, you know, third-party CSS libraries like Bootstrap. The input add-on, this is all that you need right there. The center of the image to put there, and then the 3-column layout, so that gives you how everything's laid out directly on the CSS. So that gives you a complete overview of how to use Flexbox. And so all of these examples that we walked through, and then I want to leave with you this information that I have on here. If you want to get back in touch with me, my website is appropriately jenniferbland.com. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is RatRaceGrad. That goes back to my internet marketing days where I graduated from the rat race, so I have the moniker RatRaceGrad a lot on the internet. My GitHub account used to be RatRaceGrad. I have recently renamed it to Jennifer Bland so I can separate my programming from my internet marketing side. My email address, if you would like to email me, is jennifer@jenniferbland.com. My old email address, which was ratracegrad@gmail.com, still works, so either one of those that you can use. And my Twitter handle, as I mentioned earlier, was RatRaceGrad. So if you get a chance while you're at the conference, I encourage you to tweet about the conference, tweet about the sessions that you attend, and just use RatRaceGrad that you attended my session, or the hashtag ConnectTech, all one word, so that they have information that's on there. So that's the end of my presentation. Does anybody have any questions? All right, no questions? Thank you very much for attending. I'll go ahead and leave this up for a little while if you'd like to write it down, if you need to get in touch with me later. Thank you very much for attending.